What happens when Nurgle and Slaanesh fight over the same soul? Have you ever wondered what happens when two chaos gods set their gaze upon the same soul? It is a question whispered only in the deepest corners of the warp, a question so dangerous that even demons hesitate before speaking it aloud. For when Nurgle and Slaanesh both reach for a mortal spirit, destiny fractures, reality quakes, and the warp itself begins to rot and shimmer under the pull of two opposing hungers. And this time, it all began with a single man who never imagined he could matter to gods. His name was Plaguefather, a lowborn scribe of a dying imperial world called Threnos IV. He had no noble blood, no warrior's legacy, no heretical ambitions. He lived a quiet life sorting data slates in the dust-ridden archives beneath the governor's palace. But the warp watches everything, and fate rarely chooses the worthy, only the vulnerable. Kale's tragedy began the night the sky tore open above Threnos IV, and the first whispers touched him. Kale had always been different. Sensitive, too aware of emotions, his own and others. He felt sadness the way some people felt weather. He sensed fear like heat radiating from another person's skin. The apothecaries called it empathic oversensitivity, but Kale knew it was more. Something within him resonated with suffering and desire alike, as if his soul were a tuning fork for the emotions of the world. And in the warp, two ancient gods felt that resonance. The first to notice him was Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, who drifted through Kale's dreams like silk smoke. Kale would wake trembling, heart pounding, hearing whispers that felt like pleasure and terror intertwined. Whispers promising release, transcendence, perfection. He didn't understand them, and he feared them, but he couldn't deny their pull. There was something intoxicating about the way they made him feel seen. But Nurgle noticed too. Unlike Slaanesh's seductive whispers, Nurgle's presence arrived slow and heavy, like damp air before decay sets in. Kale began suffering unexplained fevers, persistent aches, strange fatigue that clung to him like humidity. He didn't realize these were not symptoms of illness, they were tendrils of grandfather Nurgle's affection. For Nurgle does not seduce, he embraces. He does not tempt, he offers comfort in despair. And Kale's deep empathy made him a ripe seedling for that comfort. The two gods touched him in different ways, pulling him from opposite directions. Pleasure and pain, desire and despair, excess and entropy. Kale did not yet know his soul was becoming a battlefield. His descent began the night he stayed late in the archives. A storm raged across Threnos IV, thunder shaking the walls, lightning bleaching the sky white. Kale worked alone, the dim lumen lamps flickering above him as he sorted old astropathic transcripts. They were filled with corrupted messages, warp echoes, fragmented signals, words that did not belong to mortals. One datacube pulsed faintly with residual energy. Curious, Kale activated it. The room instantly plunged into cold darkness. An unseen pressure pushed against his skull. He gasped as a voice, sinuous, musical, impossibly beautiful, whispered behind him. Plaguefather, do you crave more than this? Kale stumbled backward, heart hammering. The datacube glowed like molten amethyst. The air shimmered around him. His skin tingled with electric sweetness. He felt wanted. Then the temperature dropped. The sweetness curdled into rot. A second voice, deep and warm and terrible in its kindness, seeped into the room like damp air through stone. Child, you hurt. Let grandfather ease your suffering. The contrasting presences collided inside him, one cold and vibrant, the other warm and suffocating. The lights flickered violently. Papers flew from shelves. Kale fell to his knees, clutching his skull as agony lanced through his mind. Two gods were speaking to him. Two gods were claiming him. Two gods were tearing at the roots of his soul. Kale screamed. In that moment, Threnos IV changed forever. Because when a mortal soul becomes contested property of rival gods, the warp responds. A shockwave rippled outward through the archives, vaporizing lumen lamps, cracking stone pillars, sending tremors through the palace foundations. Miles above, citizens looked up as the sky twisted into sickly colors, violet and green spiraling together in impossible patterns. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica felt the psychic distortion immediately. Astropaths collapsed bleeding from their eyes. Sanctioned psychers began convulsing. The governor demanded answers, but none were clear. Something unprecedented was happening, something catastrophic. And all of it centered on a single terrified man curled on the cold archive floor, whispering through clenched teeth. Please, someone, let go. But neither god let go. Both tightened their grip, and the war for Plaguefather had begun. Kale's scream did not merely echo through the archive, it resonated through the warp like a tuning fork struck by a cosmic hammer. Souls crackled around him like sparks, reality thinning as competing godly forces tightened their invisible claws around his mind. The air shuddered with pressure, vibrating with two rhythms, one a feverish, seductive melody, the other a slow, heavy thrum like a heartbeat swollen with infection. Kale's vision blurred into streaks of color. Violet light pulsed in front of him, Slaanesh's touch, radiant, shimmering, intoxicating. It promised liberation from fear, from insignificance, from a life spent in shadows. It whispered of transformation, beauty, and ecstasy beyond human comprehension. The voice coiled lovingly around his thoughts. Let me free you, Kale. You could be so much more. But then came the other presence, dense, humid, suffocating in its strange warmth. A greenish glow seeped around him, thick as mold creeping over stone. Nurgle's essence wrapped around his body like a blanket that grew heavier with each passing heartbeat. His voice was the sound of a gentle sigh amid decay. Why struggle, little one? Let grandfather hold you. Let the pain fade. Kale felt his consciousness stretching, tearing, splitting under the weight of two divine desires clawing for dominance. He clutched the edge of a shattered desk, nails digging into wood, breath quivering as sweat dripped from his brow. His heart beat too fast, then too slow, then too fast again, caught in the tug of war between stimulation and stagnation. Distantly, Kale heard the alarms blaring above the archives. Boots pounded across metal floors. Voices shouted orders, but the sounds felt muted, fading behind the warp storm erupting inside him. He tried to call out, to scream for help, but all that came out was a shaky, broken whisper. Stop. Please, stop. The warp did not stop. Instead, it opened. The archive walls melted into a swirling ocean of colors. Books disintegrated into particles of shimmering dust. Time fractured into pieces. Kale was no longer kneeling on the stone floor of an imperial building, he was suspended in a churning void where two realms collided. One side bloomed with impossible beauty, the other with thriving rot. Between them, Kale hung like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by titans. He felt fingers, ethereal, graceful, stroke his cheek. A thrill shot through him, warm and irresistible. Slaanesh's presence wrapped around him like a lover's embrace, intoxicating and terrifying. He felt desired by something infinite, and for a heartbeat, the feeling was enough to break through his fear. But then cold wetness seeped across his back. Weight settled over his shoulders. Something like vines, soft, swollen, pulsing with virulent life, curled around his body. Nurgle's caress was tender in a way that felt wrong, comforting in a way that suffocated. Kale's fatigued bones throbbed with disease that hadn't yet manifested, but lived beneath his skin like seedlings ready to bloom. Two gods, two opposing eternities, both claiming a single man. Kale tried to tear free, but his thoughts scattered like feathers in a storm. Every emotion he felt, fear, shame, longing, despair, fed one of the gods. His empathy, once his quiet burden, had become the very thread that tied him to their interest. He felt himself dissolving, his identity unraveling. Then the warp rippled. Something else felt him. In the far reaches of the Immaterium, demons paused. They sensed a disturbance, a mortal soul generating a psychic beacon so bright, so torn, so violently contested, it threatened to tear open a rift. And demons, being creatures of hunger and opportunity, took notice. 100 whispering voices hissed Kale's name. 1,000 invisible eyes blinked open. The warp was watching him. The mortal world reacted violently. Outside the archives, soldiers struggled to stay grounded as gravity warped in pulses. The palace walls moaned under impossible pressure. The entire city of Threnos IV felt reality bending. Civilians collapsed in the streets. Vox channels devolved into static. Servitors malfunctioned and attacked each other. The soul of Kale Vorith had become a psychic fault line, and the planet trembled beneath it. In the warp void, Kale finally managed a desperate cry. Why me? The answer came in two overlapping voices, beautiful and hideous, gentle and cruel. Because your soul sings to us. And then, without warning, the battle escalated. Kale's cry rippled through the warp like a wound being torn open. It wasn't sound anymore, it was pure emotion, raw and unfiltered, a burst of terror so intense it radiated for miles across the Immaterium. And in that moment, the thin membrane separating reality from nightmare began to split. Not fully, not visibly, but enough for the warp to breathe, enough for the gods to tighten their grip. Kale felt a sudden jolt in his chest. A violent pull. His soul lurched forward as if invisible hooks were tearing him toward two different directions at once. The sensation was unbearable, like drowning and suffocating and being set aflame simultaneously. He clutched his head and screamed into the void as violet tendrils of Slaanesh wrapped around his ribcage, tugging him toward a realm of intoxicating brilliance. "Yield, Kale," Slaanesh whispered, voice dripping like honey through his mind. "Give yourself to me, and I will elevate every flaw into perfection." But before Kale could even process the words, a wave of sticky warmth slammed through him. Green luminescence pulsed across his body. Nurgle's power pressed into his lungs, his skin, his bones, gentle yet overwhelming, oppressive yet strangely tender. "Do not struggle, child," Nurgle murmured, a rumble that vibrated deep within Kale's chest. "You carry pain. Come to me, and let all your hurt rot away." One promise tasted like forbidden ecstasy. The other felt like relief from every burden he had ever carried. And Kale, fragile, empathic, terrified Kale, was breaking under the weight of both. His heartbeat became erratic, his breath hitched in uneven bursts. His thoughts spun like wheels on wet stone. Nothing felt solid anymore, not even himself. He sensed his will beginning to dissolve, like wax softening under two opposing flames. Suddenly, the ground beneath him vanished. Kale dropped into nothingness, spiraling through a dizzying vortex where shards of his memories spun around him like broken glass. He saw his childhood on Threnos IV, quiet and lonely. He saw himself working in the archives, unseen by thousands. He saw the moments where he felt everything too deeply, times when someone else's grief left him shaking, or someone's joy brought him to tears. He had always believed this empathy was a curse. But now he understood the truth. His soul had always been exposed, naked to the warp, vulnerable to cosmic hunger. He was never invisible. He was a beacon, and the gods had been listening his whole life. As he fell deeper, Kale felt something twist inside him, a realization blooming like a poisonous flower. This was not an accident. He had been chosen, not for greatness, not for destiny, but for consumption. That understanding ripped through him, and with it came a surge of fear so potent it cracked the warp around him like lightning across stained glass. The churning void trembled, splintering with fissures of green pus and violet light. Both gods reacted instantly. Slaanesh's voice sharpened, losing its softness and turning into a hiss of possessive hunger. "Do not fear anyone but me, Kale. You belong to my perfection." Nurgle's voice deepened, a rumbling quake of jealous protectiveness. "No, little one, you are mine, my gift, my garden's newest bloom." Their power collided, violently. The warp imploded around Kale, folding in on itself. A psychic shockwave burst outward, so forceful that it slammed back into reality like a hammer against glass. On Threnos IV, the effect was catastrophic. In the city above the archives, windows exploded outward. Vox towers fell sideways. Brass statues cracked and split. People dropped to their knees gasping as pressure rippled through the air. Some felt pleasure so sharp it bled into pain. Others felt despair so crushing it hollowed their chests. The emotions weren't theirs, they were fragments of the gods, power bleeding through Kale. A lone sanctioned psyker standing on the palace balcony gasped as he saw a fracture of violet-green lightning rip through the sky. "Emperor, preserve us." His voice was shaking. "A soul is being tugged apart." Meanwhile, deep in the warp, Kale's falling abruptly stopped. Two colossal forces yanked him upward, suspending him in the void like a marionette suspended between two monstrous puppeteers. He felt their wills crash against each other, Slaanesh's sharp and vibrant, Nurgle's heavy and unyielding. Their hatred for one another was ancient, primal, and now entirely focused on him. Kale's voice cracked as he whispered, Why can't you leave me alone?" This time, the answer did not come in warmth or seduction. It came in violence. The warp tore open like wet paper, and something vast began to emerge. The tear in the warp widened with a sickening scream, like flesh parting under a serrated blade. Kale felt the pressure first, a crushing, suffocating weight, as if the very fabric of reality were being forced aside to make room for something that should never be near a mortal soul. His lungs seized, his mind quivered, and the air around him warped into a storm of colors that bled and hissed like living paint. Then the first shadow emerged. It wasn't a form, not yet, just an outline, vague, shifting, unsettling in its impossibility. The edges shimmered between violet brilliance and putrid green rot, as if the warp itself could not decide what this presence was supposed to represent. Two powers pushed forward simultaneously, colliding and intertwining like serpents locked in a perpetual struggle. Kale realized, with a horror so deep it hollowed him, that both gods were reaching too close. Too directly, too dangerously. They didn't send demons. They didn't send servants. They were pushing their influence personally. A mortal soul that draws two gods. That is rare, and rarity draws obsession. The first whisper came from the violet half of the shadow. Smooth, melodic, and thrumming with desire, it coiled around Kale's consciousness like a velvet ribbon tightening around raw flesh. Look at you. The voice was soft, intimate, breathless with hunger. You feel everything, don't you? Every wound, every yearning. Such exquisite sensitivity, such potential. Kale tried to turn away, but the voice followed him like a lover's breath on the back of his neck. His heart pounded under the weight of that attention, each beat echoing like a drum in the void. Then the other half of the shadow spoke, slower, thicker, warmer, its tone heavy with affection that felt like a suffocating blanket soaked in mildew. Child, do not listen to the pain they would give you. Come to me. Let your sorrow be soothed. Let your weaknesses be embraced. I ask nothing but your acceptance. Kale shook violently as the two voices overlapped inside his skull, one promising exaltation, the other promising release. His mind strained under the dual assault, stretched thin like a membrane about to tear. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His throat tightened, forcing out a ragged gasp. Stop, please, I can't. But they did not stop. They moved closer. Slaanesh's influence hit him first, a rush of sensation so sharp it left him breathless. His skin tingled, his nerves burned, his emotions surged into an overwhelming storm of intensity. Every fear sharpened into a blade. Every heartbeat felt like fire. It wasn't pleasure. It wasn't pain. It was something more primal, an amplification of existence itself. Kale felt too alive, too exposed, too vulnerable. He wanted to claw his own skin just to escape the suffocating pressure of sensation. But before he could collapse, Nurgle's touch swept over him like thick, warm fog. It pressed into his chest, heavy but comforting. His fears dulled, his shame softened, pain melted into a numb, drowsy haze. The world felt distant, muffled, quiet. His heartbeat slowed, his nerves slackened, his frantic breath steadied. For a single moment, Kale tasted peace. And then both powers collided. The shock tore through him like a spear of molten metal. His body jerked violently. His mind erupted with white-hot agony. Kale screamed, an animalistic wail ripped from the deepest part of his being. The gods' forces clashed within his soul, twisting it like fabric caught between two grinding gears. The shadow in front of him split violently in two. On one side, violets, pinks, golds, shimmering with dangerous beauty. A silhouette that danced and pulsed with seductive energy. Eyes like amethysts burning with desire. On the other side, greens, browns, yellows, bubbling with decay and life intertwined. A massive outline wreathed in spores, warmth, and grotesque affection. Kale's breath caught. They weren't fully manifest, but their presence was undeniable. Two chaos gods, reaching for him, directly. The warp around them twisted and bled, reality straining under the weight of their competing attention. Every moment they remained this close to the mortal realm increased the instability tenfold. Kale whispered, barely audible, I'm going to die, but the truth was far worse. He wasn't just at risk of dying. He was at risk of being claimed. Slaanesh's form flickered with amusement, voice purring inside his skull. Die? No, Kale, I would never waste something so exquisite. Nurgle's laugh rumbled warmly, thick and horrible. Grandfather does not take life away, little blossom, he gives it. And then, without warning, the world convulsed. Reality ripped open behind Kale. He turned. Something was stepping through. Something hungry. Something drawn by the scent of a soul being fought over by gods. And this time, it wasn't a god. It was a demon. No, many demons. Drawn like sharks to blood. The air behind Kale didn't split with a clean tear this time. It burst, rupturing with a wet, guttural sound like a carcass being ripped open. A blast of hot, fetid wind slammed into his back, carrying with it a cacophony of shrieks, hisses, and hungry chittering. Kale staggered forward, nearly collapsing, as the warp wound widened and the first shapes pushed through. They were not graceful. They were not majestic. They were starving. Demons did not often dare intrude in the middle of a god claim, but this situation was too intoxicating to resist. A mortal soul pulled by two divine forces at once radiated excess psychic energy, raw, unguarded, uncontrolled. To a demon, it was irresistible. A beacon of vulnerability. A wound leaking power. A feast. The first creature that clawed its way out was thin and elongated, its limbs bending at impossible angles like broken marionette joints. It had no face, only a smooth, stretched membrane where features should have been. But the mouth beneath that membrane was unmistakable, a jagged, trembling slit that gaped open with a low, warbling moan. Slaanesh's influence clung to it like perfume. Behind it surged another form, fat, bloated, dripping with pus that sizzled as it hit the ground. Its open gut pulsed like a diseased sack. Flies buzzed around it in a frenzy, swarming over its peeling flesh. Its wide, lipless grin opened into a burbling laugh. This one was Nurgle spawned. 2 demons, 2 rival hungers, both drawn by the soul suspended between gods. Kale backed away, but the floor, or what he thought was the floor, shifted beneath him like rippling liquid. The warp no longer resembled anything natural. Space stretched, twisted, folded. Nothing was stable. His palms pressed against what felt like warm flesh, then cold metal, then soft sand, all changing in an instant. Behind him, more demons poured through the warp wound, sleek, shimmering figures with elongated tongues and too many fingers, followed by lumpy, waddling things that left puddles of sludge with every step. They hissed at each other as they emerged, their energies clashing violently. The Slaaneshi creatures sensed beauty in Kale's suffering. The Nurglite beasts sensed promise in his despair. And yet, none of them dared touch him. Not yet, for nearby, the shadows of their gods loomed, half-formed but unmistakably present. Even demons, hungry beyond reason, hesitated under the gaze of such power. But hesitation did not mean obedience. The faceless Slaaneshi demon tilted its featureless head toward Kale, drawn by the thrum of his frantic heartbeat. The trembling slit of its hidden mouth quivered with anticipation. It reached out with a hand that split into 5 writhing tendrils. Kale froze. Before it could touch him, a massive, mucus-covered hand smashed into the ground between them with a wet thunderclap, sending cracks of green rot splintering across the surface. Heat and humidity exploded outward. The smell of damp earth and spoiled fruit filled the air. Nurgle's half-manifest shadow growled. No, the sound was not loud, but it vibrated through Kale's bones like a warning that came from the center of the universe. The Slaaneshi demon skittered backward, trembling, limbs twisting like ribbons in a sudden wind. But another ran forward, a slender creature whose body rippled like liquid metal, its many eyes blinking in erratic patterns as it lunged toward Kale with jagged elegance. It moved with such grace it seemed almost beautiful, almost mesmerizing, until Kale saw its spine bending like soft wax, reshaping to propel it faster. It was inches from him when a wave of warm, putrid fog rolled across the ground, lifting the creature off its limbs and flinging it backward. It shrieked as the fog clung to its skin, burning through whatever mockery of flesh it possessed. Slaanesh's shadow hissed, furious. Do not touch what is mine. Nurgle's shadow swelled, dripping contagion that sizzled on the invisible floor. Do not mar my gift. Their voices struck each other like blades. Demons reeled, some collapsing, others shrieking in delight at the rising tension. Even the warp itself shuddered, excited, terrified, anticipating. Kale's knees buckled. His breath came in rapid, ragged bursts. A pounding headache drove spikes of pain into the back of his skull. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer. He could feel the demons, eyes crawling across his skin. He felt their hunger, their yearning to taste even a fragment of his soul before the gods claimed it. He could not scream. He could barely breathe. The factions of demons began to circle him, pushed into a frenzy by their gods' escalating aggression. The Slaaneshi creatures writhed with anticipation, bodies twisting into seductive horrors. The Nurglite beasts oozed malice and affection in equal measure, dripping slime that hissed on the void floor. They moved closer, 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 until the 2 god shadows reacted at the same time. Slaanesh's presence sharpened, piercing the void with a surge of shimmering, electric ecstasy. Nurgle's presence thickened, saturating the air with rotting warmth. And Kale, the fragile, trembling mortal at the center, felt the impossible happen. Both gods pulled him toward themselves. At once, with full force. The shockwave that erupted was violent enough to tear demons apart in mid-movement. The warp screamed. The gods roared. Kale's soul convulsed, and something ancient and catastrophic awakened in response. The shockwave rolled out like a tidal blast made of soundless thunder, ripping through the void with enough force to shred lesser demons into ribbons of warped flesh. Kale felt it hit him not like an impact, but like a tearing, as if something deep inside him had been wrenched out of place. His head snapped back, his spine arched. For a moment, He couldn't tell if he was screaming or if the warp was screaming through him. The two gods pulled harder. Slaanesh's influence surged in sharp, electric bursts that flooded his nerves until his skin felt too tight for his body. Every emotion within him amplified into unbearable extremes. Fear became terror. Vulnerability became exposure. Confusion became a dizzy, nauseating swirl of sensation that blurred pleasure and agony together until he could no longer tell them apart. Nurgle's force pushed back with equal intensity. Warmth pressed through his veins like molten resin. His limbs grew heavy, lethargic, numb. His pain dulled, then softened, then blurred into a strange comfort that made part of him want to sink into the void and sleep for a century. His fear thinned into exhaustion. His terror mellowed into a weary ache. Kale's soul was being stretched, pulled, twisted, and he knew, that if either god gained another inch, he would cease to be himself. He would be broken, reshaped into something else. A servant, a slave, a puppet of divinity. His chest convulsed as his voice cracked into a hoarse whisper. Stop, stop, I'm not yours. The moment the words left him, the void stilled. Slaanesh froze. Nurgle paused. The demons fell silent, their hunger momentarily replaced by shock. A mortal, had dared to reject two gods mid-claim. It was not defiance. It was not rebellion. It was desperation, but the warp listened anyway. Kale floated in the silence, trembling uncontrollably. His breath came in ragged gasps. His vision swam, but the tiny spark of resistance, fragile, flickering, trembling, hung in the air like a fragile light in endless darkness. Slaanesh reacted first. A whisper, soft but threaded with razor wire. Not ours. Violet light flared, twisting into a mocking smile of pure disdain. Then tell me, Kale, whose are you? Kale's heart hammered. His muscles shook. His thoughts blurred. He didn't know the answer. He had never belonged to anyone. Never been chosen. Never been wanted. And now he was wanted by beings he feared more than death itself. Before he could speak, Nurgle's shadow leaned closer, dripping warmth like infected rain. Poor little blossom, you hurt because you resist. You fight because you are afraid. The voice thickened, affectionate in its suffocating way. Come to me, and you will never fear again. I will take everything from you, including the burden of choosing. Kale's stomach twisted violently. He didn't want that. He didn't want to be empty. He didn't want to be numb. But Slaanesh's voice cut in sharply, pressing into the cracks of his fear. He lies. He would drown you in stagnation. With me, you would feel everything you were meant to feel. You would transcend humanity. You would become more than a shrinking, trembling little creature. The two influences surged again, pressing against one another, each trying to fill the gaps in Kale's weakening will. Kale shook his head violently. Tears streaked down his face, burning hot. He didn't know how to escape. He didn't know if escape was even possible. He only knew one thing. He was breaking, and the warp could taste it. As Kale's spirit quaked, something deep inside him began to split, not his soul, but something older, quieter. A barrier he never knew he carried. A sealed-off place within him that had been dormant his entire life. It cracked like old stone. A hum rose from Kale's chest. Soft at first, barely noticeable, then it grew, and grew. A vibration, deep, resonant, ancient, filled the void around him. The demons recoiled instantly, hissing and screeching in confusion. Even Slaanesh's gaze narrowed. Even Nurgle paused. The hum wasn't warp-born. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't mortal. It was something else. Kale clutched his chest as the vibration intensified, radiating outward in strange, rhythmic pulses that distorted the air around him. His entire body shook. His eyes rolled back. A glow, faint but unmistakably real, pushed through the cracks in his aura. Slaanesh hissed. Nurgle growled. Both gods recoiled, not far, but enough for the pressure on Kale's soul to ease. Because the glow carried a frequency they despised. A frequency they recognized. A frequency they feared. Kale didn't understand what was happening, but something inside him unfurled, like a dormant seed awakening in the presence of danger. Something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Slaanesh's voice darkened, losing its teasing softness. You are not supposed to have that. Nurgle's tone dropped into a low, rumbling warning. Child, what have you hidden inside you? Kale shook violently. The glow surged again, stronger, brighter, washing over him in protective waves. He couldn't answer. He didn't know. He had never known. But the warp did. The warp trembled. And far, far in the immaterium, beyond the reach of any god watching this conflict, a long-forgotten entity stirred, awakened by the beacon rising from Kale's heart. Something ancient, something exiled, something that should have stayed asleep. The demons sensed it first, and they were afraid. The moment the soul, Ethyros, felt itself torn between the two gods, reality inside the warp buckled like a wounded beast. Etheric winds shrieked, twisting into spirals of color and rot, petals of impossible beauty mixing with blossoms of decay. And from within this storm, Ethyros finally screamed, not in fear, but in awareness. For the first time since its mortal death, the soul could sense its own shape, its own purpose, like a faint outline emerging from darkness. Slaanesh's pull wrapped around one half of its essence, whispering pleasure, destiny, irresistible transformation. Nurgle's grasp held the other half, warm and heavy, promising acceptance, rest, and eternal belonging. The soul hung suspended between them, trembling, flickering like a candle poised between two hurricanes. And inside its splitting consciousness, a memory surfaced, unbidden, violent, and ancient. A battlefield, a broken world, a choice long ago denied. The gods stopped. They felt the memory too. They felt the sudden ripple in the soul that neither of them had created. And in that moment, a single truth became clear to both. This soul had not simply wandered into their grasp. It had been shaped, crafted, by something older, darker, and far more dangerous than either of them expected. The memory did not fade. It expanded, flooding the warp storm with a violent clarity that forced even gods to pause. Ethyros saw himself, back when he still wore flesh, standing on a shattered plain littered with the dead. The sun above had been choked out by smoke. The earth trembled beneath marching ceramite boots. But it wasn't the war that mattered. It was the presence behind him, the shadow he had followed, the power he had once believed was his destiny. A towering figure wrapped in shimmering strands of fate, not beautiful, not horrific, but inevitable. Not Slaanesh, not Nurgle, someone else, someone who had laid the first thread in the tapestry of his life. And as the memory sharpened, the warp reacted like a wounded animal. Colors bled, lights blinked out, the storm itself recoiled as if struck. For the figure in the memory, the one even Ethyros had forgotten, was a being whose very name made gods shift uneasily. Not a chaos god, but an ancient force from before the primordial truth fractured into four. A source of prophecy, ruin, and contradiction. An architect of endings long buried. Slaanesh's voice snapped through the storm first, sharp with irritation beneath the silk. This is not your making, grandfather. Nor is it mine. Someone else touched this soul. Nurgle's reply rumbled like distant thunder. Yes, and whoever seeded this echo did so with foresight. Perhaps this soul was never meant for either of us. Ethyros felt the pull on his essence weaken, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. For the first time since the struggle began, both gods hesitated. The soul drifted, no longer being torn apart, but hanging in a silence so heavy it could crush stars. And then it understood. The memory was not accidental. It was a message, one that had waited until the gods revealed their greed. The shadowed figure turned within the memory, faceless yet familiar, and whispered across the gulf of time. Your fate does not belong to them. And as the echo faded, Ethyros felt a strange shift, like a door creaking open inside the warp. A new power stirring, one neither god recognized. A choice forming where no choice should exist. The first crack in a conflict that was about to spiral far beyond a simple fight over a single soul. For the first time since the struggle began, Ethyros felt a space inside himself where the chaos of two gods did not reach, a sliver of clarity, small but undeniable. It was a presence that neither shimmered with beauty nor reeked with decay, a force that carried neither desire nor comfort, yet radiated authority in a way that even Slaanesh and Nurgle could feel. The gods recoiled, instinctively, each recognizing the anomaly as something ancient, something older than their rivalry, something beyond the constructs of pleasure, despair, and consumption. The presence pulsed, slow and deliberate, filling Ethyros' essence with something terrifyingly simple: awareness. Awareness of self, awareness of choice, awareness that he did not have to belong to either god. For the first time, he realized his soul was not merely a battleground, it was a weapon, or perhaps a key. And every tremor of understanding sent waves through the warp, making even the demons skitter back in instinctive caution. Slaanesh hissed, voice dripping venomous silk. What is this? Who dares intrude in my domain? Nurgle growled, thick and moist like wet stone. Something, not yet named, not yet understood, that even I cannot embrace. Ethyros' heartbeat quickened. The presence coiled around his consciousness, but it did not suffocate. Instead, it empowered him. He felt the edges of the Slaaneshi pleasure, the heavy embrace of Nurgle's decay, and he understood them both for what they truly were: hunger and claim, not guidance, not protection. He had been their prize, their obsession, their plaything. And now, he did not have to be. The demons, sensing the shift, faltered. They no longer lunged with reckless hunger. Their unnatural bodies quivered as if the air itself rejected their approach. Even the two gods tensed, their shadows warring but now tinged with caution. Ethyros whispered, a sound that carried through the warp, a sound that was both mortal and impossibly resonant. No more, and in that word, a wave of power emanated from him. The war of gods wavered, the demons hesitated, the warp itself shivered. For a single, suspended heartbeat, everything listened. He did not know what this force was, only that it existed. Something primal, buried deep inside the soul, a fragment of a destiny older than the gods, petty feuds. Something that might, if he could wield it, turn the tables entirely. And the storm around him seemed to understand this new balance. For the first time, the battle for Ethyros' soul was no longer entirely in the hands of the gods. Ethyros felt it, a spark deep in his chest, a seed of defiance that had been buried under centuries of fear and manipulation. It was tiny at first, almost imperceptible, a whisper in the cacophony of the warp. But it grew rapidly, spreading like wildfire through the strands of his consciousness. Every nerve, every thought, every fragment of his being began to pulse with a force that was entirely his own. For the first time, he realized he could fight back, not with weapons, not with armies, but with the raw essence of his own soul. Slaanesh shrieked in rage, a sound like silk tearing across razor blades, as violet tendrils surged toward him. Nurgle bellowed in dissonant delight, green rot spreading in waves, pressing like a suffocating tide. Both powers collided around him, twisting the warp into impossible shapes, yet Ethyros no longer trembled. He no longer quivered. He did not flee. He expanded, radiating a light that was neither warm nor seductive, but absolute. With a thought, he severed the first tendril of Slaanesh, forcing it to coil back like a striking snake. With another, he pushed Nurgle's embrace away, splintering the comforting weight into shards of rotten warmth that drifted harmlessly into the void. The gods, immortal and ancient, froze, their surprise palpable across the warp. No mortal had ever resisted them so directly. No mortal had ever taken the initiative. Ethyros' voice rang out, not as a whisper, not as a plea, but as a declaration. I am not yours. I am not a prize. I am not a weapon. I am myself. The demons recoiled, their instinct screaming. Even the warp, unpredictable and chaotic, seemed to pause to witness this singular act of defiance. Slaanesh's fury sharpened, becoming nearly palpable, a storm of unfulfilled desire twisting violet. Lightning into jagged arcs, Nurgle's deep rumble turned from protective to threatening, rolling like an approaching plague. Both gods realized something terrifying. The soul they had coveted, fought over, and claimed to desire had become a force beyond their control. And in that moment, Ethyros understood a truth that would shape the rest of the battle. He did not need to choose. He could exist in the space between them, unclaimed, unconquered, and unbroken. The thought was intoxicating, terrifying, and liberating all at once. The warp convulsed around him, as if sensing the shift. Colors twisted violently. The demons shrieked and darted back into the shadows, afraid of crossing a soul that no longer bent to chaos. And for the first time, Ethyros felt power, not given, not borrowed, but awakened from within. A weapon forged not in war, but in self-possession. And with that, he prepared to strike. Ethyros' defiance surged outward like a shockwave, fracturing the lingering tendrils of Slaanesh and Nurgle around him. The gods recoiled, each realizing that this mortal, this single, fragile, extraordinary soul, was no longer a pawn but an independent force. Violet light clashed violently with green rot, swirling in impossible patterns around him, yet neither could claim dominion. The demons scattered, shrieking in confusion and retreating into the deepest recesses of the warp, sensing the emergence of something far older and far more dangerous than themselves. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. The storm of chaos paused, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Ethyros hung in the void, trembling but steady, aware of the full scope of his awakening. He was no longer Kael Vorith, the timid scribe. He was Ethyros, a soul tempered in the crucible of godly hunger, molded in the storm of seduction and decay, yet entirely his own. And in that truth, he found clarity. The shadows of the gods lingered, furious, resentful, yet restrained. They could not touch him, not because they lacked power, but because the soul had reached a level of self-possession they had never anticipated. Slaanesh hissed, voice sharp and silky. "This is unexpected." Nurgle rumbled, a deep, wet chuckle tempered with irritation. "You have grown, little blossom, far beyond our intentions." Etheiros did not respond. Words were unnecessary. His very presence, a beacon of resistance and awakening, communicated a force that no god could dominate. Slowly, the warp settled around him, the violent storm collapsing into calm turbulence. Colors blended and softened, wrought and silk coexisting in uneasy truce. The demons, sensing the end of the immediate feast, withdrew entirely, leaving only whispers of chaos in their wake. And then, slowly, the mortal plane, Threnos IV, stirred back to life. The sky returned to its usual hue, the trembling city streets stilled, and the survivors of the psychic shock began to grasp that something extraordinary had transpired. Somewhere deep in the Immaterium, Slaanesh and Nurgle continued to fume, their attention temporarily restrained, aware that a mortal had defied their claim. Yet their rage was tempered by grudging respect, an understanding that the universe still held secrets even they could not consume. Etheiros drifted silently in the void for a long moment, feeling the aftershocks of what had occurred. He was changed irrevocably, forever, but he was free, and in freedom, he felt the hum of possibility, the knowledge that even the gods' oldest schemes could be resisted, even their oldest hungers could be denied. A single mortal had become a symbol, a spark, a reckoning. He whispered to the void, not as a plea, not as fear, but as a declaration. "I belong to no one. I am myself, and I will endure." The warp trembled in response. The echoes of God's rivalry lingered like shadows across reality, but for the first time, a mortal had walked away whole, unclaimed, and unbroken. And though the storm of chaos would never forget, Etheiros had proven that even in a universe ruled by hunger, despair, and ecstasy, willpower could create its own destiny. The universe shifted imperceptibly. Somewhere in the Immaterium, the two chaos gods stewed in their impotent fury. But the lesson had been learned. Not every soul can be bought, every desire cannot be taken, and some mortals, rare, extraordinary, can stand alone even against eternity. And with that, Etheiros drifted into the calm after the storm, a soul fully awake, fully alive, and entirely his own. The end.